All right, you guys. So we are pretty much halfway through with The Great Gatsby, and after chapter 6, things really start ramping up, which I'm very, very excited about. So before I get into chapter 6, like usual, we're just going to quickly review chapter 5. In chapter 5, Gatsby and Daisy reunite at Nick's house for tea. We know that it is awkward, it's very uncomfortable, and the motif of weather really communicates that. It communicates Gatsby's mood at the beginning with the rain, the brief moments of sunshine, more rain, and then ultimately, a beautiful day at the end. We know that there is a symbol of the overwound and broken clock, and that it is his representation, Fitzgerald's representation of Gatsby and Gatsby's desire to turn back time back to 5 years ago when he first met Daisy. But ultimately the clock is broken, right? And then Gatsby shows Daisy his house. Daisy is absolutely amazed. And Nick kind of leaves them to reminisce together. So in chapter 6, what we're really going to end up seeing is this combination of both of the worlds, right? So you've got the world of West Egg, which is the new money. It's where Gatsby lives. It's this, riotous affair. There's less class. And then you have, obviously, East Egg, which is represented through Daisy and Tom. So in this chapter 1, we're going to learn about Gatsby's actual history, where he actually comes from. And we're also going to see this combination and kind of a clashing of these two worlds because Daisy and Tom end up coming to one of Gatsby's parties, which is the first time ever that either Tom or Daisy have been there. And so it's going to be a real evaluation of Gatsby, of Daisy and Gatsby's relationship. So it's a very fascinating chapter, especially when it comes to interpersonal relationships. So if you guys will turn to your books to chapter 6, for my book, it starts at page 97. About this time, an ambitious young reporter from New York arrived one morning at Gatsby's door and asked him if he had anything to say. Anything to say about what? Inquired Gatsby politely. Why, any statement to give out. It transpired after a confused 5 minutes that the man had heard Gatsby's name around his office in a connection which he either wouldn't reveal or didn't fully understand. This was his day off, and with laudable initiative, he had hurried out to see. It was a random shot, and yet the reporter's instinct was right. Gatsby's notoriety spread about the hundreds who had accepted his hospitality and so became authorities upon his past, had increased all summer until he fell just short of being news. Contemporary legends such as the underground pipeline to Canada attached themselves to him, and there was one persistent story that he didn't live in a house at all, but in a boat that looked like a house and was moved secretly up and down the Long Island shore. So I'm going to pause there. Notoriety, I'm sure you guys have heard that. The actual definition is it's a state of being famous or well known for a bad quality or deed. Not a good quality, but specifically bad. And you have this kind of like probably young, upstarting reporter who wants to get ahead of the story, and so on his day off, he decides to go above and beyond, track Gatsby down and say, hey, do you have a comment? Because so many people had visited Gatsby's house, and therefore they kind of claimed like, oh, well, like I've been to his party. I actually know Gatsby. Like his history is this, this, and this. So they claimed to know more about him than they did. And so obviously, rumors start spreading, people start attaching their names even though they have no right to, and Gatsby falls just short of being news. And then the underground pipeline to Canada kind of also like emphasizes the fact that Gatsby probably made his money from bootlegging, because in the 1920s, there was this massive scandal that people were transporting illegal liquor from Canada. So anyway, continuing. Just why these inventions were a source of satisfaction to James Gatz of North Dakota isn't easy to say. James Gatz. That was really, or at least legally, his name. He had changed it at the age of 17, and at the specific moment that witnessed the beginning of his career, when he saw Dan Cody's yacht drop anchor over the most insidious flat on Lake Superior. It was James Gatz who had been loafing along the beach that afternoon in a torn green jersey and a pair of canvas pants. But it was already Jay Gatsby who borrowed a rowboat, pulled out to the Tuolumne, and informed Cody that a wind might catch him and break up in half an hour. So here's the first part of his history. His actual name is not Jay Gatsby, it's James Gatz. He's from North Dakota, and he changed his name at 17 years old when he saved this kind of man in the middle of the, Lake Superior who was going to essentially drown, and his name was Dan Cody. I suppose he'd had the name already for a long time, even then. His parents were shiftless and unsuccessful farm people. His imagination had never really accepted them as his parents at all. So as you can see, this is the picture that they show in the movie. He was from shiftless, unsuccessful farm people in the middle of North Dakota. So he wasn't somebody who was born into money, though he wants to communicate that he was. He actually started at the lowest of the low. Now, I'm going to explain the next line because it comes from a philosophical thought, okay? So pay close attention. And it's also very important, too, who Gatsby is and how he's created himself. The truth was that Jay Gatsby of West Egg, Long Island, sprang from his Platonic conception of himself. He was a son of God, a phrase which, if it means anything, means just that. And he must be about his father's business, the service of a vast, vulgar, and meretricious beauty. So he invented just the sort of Jay Gatsby that a 17-year-old boy would be likely to invent, and this conception he was faithful to the end. So before I really explain what's going on, Platonic conception is a reference to Plato and the Greek philosopher, as you guys can see on the left side of your screen. Plato had taught through conversation, right? Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato were kind of like the major three of Greek philosophers. And Plato's theory is that everyone and everything on earth had a more perfect form that earth was representing. So it's from his theory of the caves, but that earth was a mere shadow of what it could be, and therefore so were people. That the lives that we live, the things that we touch are just mere shadows of perfection. So this earth, these people are not perfect. And that people and things desire that perfection and therefore change their lives in order to try to reach that. So that's this idea of a Platonic conception. So he also then attaches that to Jay Gatz as a 17-year-old boy. When you guys are, and again, this is your age, right? It's often that when we're younger, we have these massive dreams and massive ideas of who we could be, what the world has in store for us. And we have these kind of fantasies and reveries of achieving those in the future. And so what Fitzgerald is essentially saying is that from a very young age, Gatsby desperately wanted more from his life. And so he dreamt about what those things would be. And therefore, everything that he did subsequently was in order to achieve that perfection from that Platonic conception of himself. So in the movie, these are the two people that, this kind of represents. So you have James Gatz, the North Dakota 17-year-old, poor farm boy on the left. And he essentially created from his mind and therefore his actions, Jay Gatsby. And he was faithful to this vision he had of himself at a young age to the end. So, continuing. For over a year, he had been beating his way along the south shore of Lake Superior as a clam digger and a salmon fisher, or in any other capacity that brought him food and bed. His brown, hardening body lived naturally through the half-fierce, half-lazy work of the bracing days. He knew women early, and since then spoiled him because he became contemptuous of them, of young virgins because they were ignorant, of others because they were hysterical about things which in his overwhelming self-absorption he took for granted. So again, he slept around with a lot of people. He became contemptuous of that, and he was self-absorbed. But his heart was in constant, turbulent riot. The most grotesque and fantastic conceits haunted him in his bed at night. A universal of ineffable gaudiness spun itself out in his brain while the clock ticked on the washstand, and the moon soaked with wet light his tangled clothes upon the floor. So again, you hear that clock, right? It says his brain while the clock ticked on the washstand. So the concept and the symbol of time is coming back. And this is where, his daydreams, his night dreams are going. He is in riot and wrestling with himself and what he could be. Each night he added to the pattern of his fancies until drowsiness closed down upon some vivid scene with an oblivious embrace. For a while these reveries provided an outlet for his imagination. They were a satisfactory hint of the unreality of reality, a promise that the rock of the world was founded securely on fairies' wings. So I just put that quote on the screen. Again, he's dreaming of this perfect world, his perfect life, the perfect person he's going to be. And it says that for a while, these dreams were satisfactory, right? He could dream about it and be content. And it provided this outlet for his creative imagination. But it also says down here, right, that it was founded securely on fairies' wings. One, fairies aren't real, right? And then if they were real, the fairies' wings are very fragile, right, and easily broken. They can't carry a lot. And so it's this idea that although he's dreaming, he's come up with this perfect conception of himself, it's really not that stable. And so there's irony in it saying securely on fairies' wings. An instinct toward future glory had led him, some months before, to the small Lutheran college of St. Olaf's in southern Minnesota. So again, he didn't go to Oxford. He went to this no-name college in southern Minnesota. He stayed there 2 weeks, dismayed at its ferocious indifference to the drums of his destiny. So again, it wasn't good enough, right? It's like, well, this isn't helping me pursue my destiny, my dream, my perfection. And so not only did he not go to Oxford, he only spent 2 weeks at college, so he never graduated from college. And despising the janitor's work with which he was to pay his way through. And so again, not only did he go to St. Olaf's for 2 weeks, but he couldn't afford. So again, talking about he comes from the lowest of the low, he couldn't even afford to pay his way through, so he had to do janitor work. So there's a massive contrast between Tom Buchanan and Gatsby. Then he drifted back to Lake Superior, and he was still searching for something to do on that day that Dan Cody's yacht dropped anchor in the shallows along shore. Cody was then 50 years old, a product of Nevada's silver fields of the Yukon, of every rush for metal since 75. So ever since 1875, Dan Cody has gone and done, the gold rushes, copper rushes, all of those things. The transactions in Montana copper that made him many times a millionaire found him physically robust, but on the verge of soft-mindedness, and, suspecting this, an infinite number of women tried to separate him from his money. The none too savory ramifications by which Ella Kay, the newspaper woman, played Madame de Matignon to his weakness and sent him to sea in a yacht, were common property of the turgid journalism of 1902. He had been coasting along all too hospitable shores for 5 years when he turned up as James Gatt's Destiny in Little Girl Bay. So Dan Cody is a millionaire because of all of the metal rushes that he had success on. However, even though his body was strong from all of the mining, his mind had kind of gone soft, and therefore he was easily manipulated by women who wanted his millions. And so then he talks about one specific situation in which Ella Kay essentially kind of got in with him and stole his money enough so that, he needed to, one, get away from the newspaper reports, and two, go out on a yacht. And that's how he comes across James Gatz. And James Gatz views Dan Cody in this appearance as his destiny. So I'll put some pictures. These are pictures that are in the movie. In Gatsby's room, there's just all of these kind of nautical maps and pictures of this man who is very much a father figure to Gatsby. To young Gatz, resting on his oars and looking up the railed deck, that yacht represented all the beauty and glamour in the world. I suppose he smiled at Cody. He had probably discovered that people liked him when he smiled. At any rate, Cody asked him a few questions. One of them elicited the brand new name, and found that he was quick and extravagantly ambitious. So again, when it says elicited the new name, it means that when Dan Cody was asking James Gatz about, hey son, what's your name? He, rather than saying James Gatz, he says Jay Gatsby. So this idea that he was going to change his name has been something that it was right on the tip of the tongue because he had been thinking about it for a very long time. And found that he was quick and extravagantly ambitious. A few days later, he took him to the Duluth and brought him a blue coat, 6 pair of white duck trousers, and a yachting cap. And when the Tuolumne left for the West Indies and the Barbary Coast, Gatsby left there too. So Dan invites him along, buys him kind of the sailing gear, and says, all right, you're coming with me. And therefore, Jay Gatz leaves his past behind. He was employed in a vague personal capacity. While he remained with Cody, he was in turn steward, mate, skipper, secretary, and even jailer for Dan Cody. For Dan Cody sober knew what the lavish doings Dan Cody drunk might soon be about, and he provided for such contingencies by reposing more and more trust in Gatsby. The arrangement lasted 5 years, during which the boat went 3 times around the continent. It might have lasted indefinitely, except for the fact that Ella Kay came on board one night in Boston, and a week later Dan Cody inhospitably died. I remember the portrait of him up in Gatsby's bedroom, a gray, florid man with a hard, empty face, the pioneer debauchee who, during one phase of American life, brought back to the eastern seaboard the savage violence from the frontier brothel and saloon. It was indirectly due to Cody that Gatsby drank so little. Sometimes, in the course of gay parties, women used to rub champagne into his hair. For himself, he formed the habit of letting liquor alone. So it's why Gatsby stays so removed at parties, is because he saw the effect that liquor had on Dan Cody and how it not only made him soft-minded, but easily manipulated. And then it even says earlier that Gatsby was not only mate, skipper, secretary, but jailer. And jailer so much so that Dan Cody trusted Gatsby enough to be able to essentially say, hey, when I'm too drunk, you need to lock me up and keep me from doing anything stupid. And it was from Cody that he inherited money, a legacy of $25,000, which back then was a lot of money. He didn't get it. He never understood the legal device that was used against him, but what remained of the millions went intact to Ella Kay. He was left with his singularly appropriate education. The vague contour of Jay Gatsby had filled out to the substantiality of a man. So somehow he got cheated out of the inheritance that Dan Cody essentially gave him by the manipulative woman who may or may not have murdered Dan Cody. But Gatsby was essentially given an education of what it meant to have money, what it meant to sail, what it meant to travel around the continent twice. And so all these kind of refinements that James Gatz didn't have, Jay Gatsby did after the 5 years of spending time with Dan Cody. So even though he didn't get the money, he got this kind of refinement of person. He told me all this very much later, but I've put it down here with the idea of exploding those first wild rumors about his antecedents, which weren't even faintly true. Moreover, he told it to me at a time of confusion, when I had reached the point of believing everything and nothing about him. So I take advantage of that short halt while Gatsby, so to speak, caught his breath, to clear this set of misconceptions away. It was a halt, too, in my association with his affairs. For several weeks I didn't see him or hear his voice on the phone. Mostly I was in New York, trotting around with Jordan and trying to ingratiate myself with her senile aunt. But finally I went over to his house one Sunday afternoon. I hadn't been there 2 minutes when somebody brought Tom Buchanan in for a drink. I was startled, naturally, but the really surprising thing was that it hadn't happened before. So now Gatsby is trying to get to know Tom. "I'm delighted to see you," said Gatsby. Oh, sorry, go back. There were a party of 3 on horseback, Tom and a man named Sloane and a pretty woman in a brown riding habit who had been there previously. "I'm delighted to see you," said Gatsby, standing on his porch. "I'm delighted to see that you dropped in." As though they cared. "Sit right down, have a cigarette or cigar." He walked around the room quickly, ringing bells. "I'll have something to drink for you in just a minute." He was profoundly affected by the fact that Tom was there, but he would be uneasy anyhow until he had given them something, realizing in a vague way that that was why they all came. So the idea is that this woman who had been previously there before was riding out with Mr. Sloane and with Tom, and is like, hey, let's stop at Gatsby's house. And Gatsby, seeing Tom for the very first time, is kind of flustered, and he's like, oh, let me get you something, because obviously, Gatsby's trying to, steal back his wife, or Tom's wife. Where was I? Mr. Sloane wanted nothing. A lemonade? No thanks. A little champagne? Nothing at all, thanks. I'm sorry. Did you have a nice ride? Very good roads around here. I suppose the automobiles. Yeah. So obviously nobody's really interested in conversation for some reason. Moved by an irresistible impulse, Gatsby turned to Tom, who had accepted the introduction as a stranger. I believe we've met somewhere before, Mr. Buchanan. Oh, yes, said Tom, gruffly polite, but obviously not remembering. So we did, I remember very well. About 2 weeks ago? That's right. You were with Nick here. I know your wife, continued Gatsby, almost aggressively. Gatsby just has to, sneak that in, right? That's so? Tom turned to me. You live near here, Nick? Next door. That's so? Mr. Sloane didn't enter into the conversation, but lounged back haughtily in his chair. The woman said nothing either, until, unexpectedly, after 2 highballs, she became cordial. We'll all come over to your next party, Mr. Gatsby, she suggested. What do you say? Certainly. I'd be delighted to have you. Be very nice, said Mr. Sloane without gratitude. Well, think we ought to be got started home. Oh, please don't hurry, Gatsby urged them. He had control of himself now, and he wanted to see more of Tom. Why don't you stay for supper? I wouldn't be surprised if some other people dropped in from New York. You come to supper with me, said the lady enthusiastically. Both of you? This included me. Mr. Sloane got to his feet. Come along, he said, but only to her. I mean it, she insisted. I'd love to have you. Lots of room. Gatsby looked at me questioningly. He wanted to go, and he didn't see that Mr. Sloane had determined he shouldn't. I'm afraid I won't be able to, I said. Well, you come, she urged, concentrating on Gatsby. Mr. Sloane murmured something close to her ear. We won't be late if we start now, she insisted aloud. I haven't got a horse, said Gatsby. I used to ride in the army, but I have never bought a horse. I'll have to follow you in my car. Excuse me for just a minute. The rest of us walked out on the porch where Sloane and the lady began an impassioned conversation aside. My God, I believe the man's coming, said Tom. Doesn't he know she doesn't want him? She says she does want him. She has a big dinner party, and he won't know a soul there, he frowned. I wonder where in the devil he met Daisy. By God, I may be old-fashioned in my ideas, but women run around too much these days to suit me. They meet all kinds of crazy fish. So, Tom obviously doesn't like the fact that his wife is potentially out of his grasp or doing something behind his back. So it's ironic because Tom obviously is, a cheater and cheats all the time. And then again, you have this idea of these people are on horses and they hang out with Tom, so they must be East Eggers. And to have a horse means you have a lot of money. And Gatsby literally shows his difference in saying, I need to take my car because he doesn't have one of those. And so Tom is essentially pointing out, he's like, one, Gatsby can't associate with us because he doesn't know anybody from East Egg. And two, she doesn't really want him. She's just trying to be polite. And that's something that Gatsby's not necessarily picking up on, at least not yet. Suddenly, Mr. Sloane and the lady walked down the steps and mounted their horses. Come on, said Mr. Sloane to Tom. We're late. We've got to go. And then to me, tell him we couldn't wait, will you? Tom and I shook hands. The rest of us exchanged a cool nod, and they trotted quickly down the drive, disappearing under the August foliage just as Gatsby, with hat and light overcoat in hand, came out the front door. So obviously Gatsby was excited to be invited to one of these parties, and he was ready, but again, they just ditched him because the invitation wasn't necessarily real, at least from the two men, Mr. Sloane and Tom Buchanan. Tom was evidently perturbed at Daisy's running around alone, for on the following Saturday night he came with her to Gatsby's party. So here we go. We have this combination of East Egg meeting West Egg. Perhaps his presence gave the evening its peculiar quality of oppressiveness. It stands out in my memory from Gatsby's other parties that summer. There were the same people, or at least the same sort of people, the same profusion of champagne, the same many-colored, many-keyed commotion. But I felt an unpleasantness in the air, a pervading harshness that hadn't been there before. Or perhaps I had merely grown used to it, grown to accept West Egg as a world complete in itself, with its own standards and its own great figures, second to nothing because it had no consciousness of being so. And now I was looking at it again, through Daisy's eyes. It is invariably saddening to look through new eyes at things upon which you have expanded your own powers of adjustment. So again, he's saying it's the same exact party, nothing's different, it's still grand, there's still champagne, it's still raucous, but now because Daisy and Tom are there, it just feels different. We know that Gatsby has essentially done all of this for Daisy, and this is the first time that Daisy's actually seeing the product of that. And so not only is Gatsby probably looking at it from Daisy's eyes, but so is Nick. And I just want you guys to think about it. It's like when you have an absolute favorite movie, TV show, book, and you just like can't wait to share it with somebody, right? When you're watching it with them, you're even more hyper aware of the movie or the TV show or the experience because you're wondering, what is this person going to think? And I hope that they don't dislike it because I love it so much. I hope they don't judge me because they don't like it. So again, it just adds this complete level of self-awareness that wasn't there before. And now, you have the West Egg standards, as you can see on the screen. You've got these West Egg standards where all of this is normal, all of this is fun, all of this is acceptable, but now you have two East Eggers, one of them in which all of this was for, coming in, and it's like, will this meet up to their expectations or will it fall drastically short? And what is that going to do for the rest of their relationship throughout the novel, right? Because this is a crystal clear image of what Gatsby is offering to Daisy. Daisy, if you come away with me, if we continue our affair, this is the life that you could have. And the worrisome thing is, what if she doesn't want it, and what if she doesn't like it? They arrived at twilight, and as we strolled out among the sparkling hundreds, Daisy's voice was playing murmurous tricks in her throat. "These things excite me so," she whispered. "If you want to kiss me any time during the evening, Nick, just let me know and I'll be glad to arrange it for you. Just mention my name or present a green card. I'm giving out green." "Look around," suggested Gatsby. "I'm looking around. I'm having a marvelous—" "You must see the faces of many people you've heard about." Tom's arrogant eyes roamed the crowd. "We don't go around very much," he said. "In fact, I was just thinking, I don't know a soul here." So again, Tom is insulting him and saying, well, I don't recognize anybody because they're not of the crowd that I hang out with. And obviously Gatsby not even letting Daisy finish I'm having a marvelous. He's saying, like, you must know people, right? Like, please like this, please like this. "Perhaps you know that lady," Gatsby indicated, a gorgeous, scarcely human orchid of a woman who sat in state under a white plum tree. Tom and Daisy stared with that peculiarly unreal feeling that accompanies the recognition of a hitherto ghostly celebrity in the movies. "She's lovely," said Daisy. "The man bending over her is her director." He took them ceremoniously from group to group, Mrs. Buchanan and Mr. Buchanan. After an instant's hesitation, he added, "the polo player." "Oh, no," objected Tom quickly. "Not me." So again, that was Gatsby's subtle way of saying, Tom, all you're ever going to be known for is the fact that you're a polo player. So it's a subtle dig at him. And Tom doesn't like that because he says, "Oh, no, that's not me." And he says something a little bit later that will prove that. But evidently the sound of it pleased Gatsby, for Tom remained the polo player for the rest of the evening. "I've never met so many celebrities," Daisy exclaimed. "I liked that man. What was his name? With a sort of blue nose." Gatsby identified him, adding that he was a small producer. "Well, I liked him anyhow." So again, notice who's there. It's not foreign dignitaries. It's not politicians. It's celebrities. And celebrities are very clearly new money West Eggers because all of their money comes from what they do with their career at that moment. So again, it's a lower class than what Tom and Daisy are used to associating with. And so then Tom says, I'd a little rather not be the polo player," said Tom pleasantly. "I'd rather look at all these famous people in oblivion." Daisy and Gatsby danced. I remember being surprised by his graceful, conservative foxtrot. I had never seen him dance before. Then they sauntered over to my house and sat on the steps for half an hour, while at her request I remained watchfully in the garden. "In case there's a flood, or a fire," she explained, "or any act of God." Tom appeared from his oblivion as we were sitting down at supper together. "Do you mind if I eat with some people over here?" he said. "A fellow's getting off some funny stuff." "Go ahead," answered Daisy genially. "And if you want to take down any addresses, here's my little gold pencil." She looked around for a moment and told me the girl was common but pretty. So Daisy is essentially saying, like, I know that you're probably going to cheat with me, so here's a gold pencil to write down addresses so you can. So again, it's a subtle dig. It's a not so subtle dig. She's saying, like, I know what you're going to do. Here you go. Do it. Because she just doesn't care anymore. She looked around after a moment and told me the girl was common but pretty, and I knew that except for half the hour she'd be alone with Gatsby, she wasn't having a good time. So again, Gatsby is essentially showing himself off, showing his world off, saying, if you come with me, this is the world that you can have. And Nick, being the observer, being the narrator, literally says, other than the hour and a half she'd been alone with Gatsby, she wasn't having a good time. Which kind of is this big discrepancy, right? Because Gatsby's done all of this for her, thinking that that's going to essentially, like, make her come with him, while Daisy only wants him, not everything that comes with him. Which is kind of ironic considering where they were 5 years ago, which was she wanted him, but he didn't have everything and therefore couldn't have him because of his class. So it's kind of this weird reversal, which, you know, makes Gatsby even more so a hopeless romantic. We were at a particularly tipsy table. That was my fault. Gatsby had been called to the phone, and I'd enjoyed the same people only 2 weeks before. But what had amused me then turned septic in the air now. Again, what amused Nick 2 weeks ago now is not amusing him, and it's kind of disgusting because he now has 2 people, Tom and Daisy, to compare it off of. It's not the same refinement, it's not the same class, and he knows that. How do you feel, Miss Bedecker? The girl addressed was trying, unsuccessfully, to slump against my shoulder. At this inquiry she sat up and opened her eyes. What? A massive and lethargic woman who had been urging Daisy to play golf with her at the local club tomorrow spoke in Miss Bedecker's defense. Oh, she's all right now. When she had 5 or 6 cocktails, she always starts screaming like that. I tell her she ought to leave it alone. I do leave it alone, affirmed the accused hollowly. We heard you yelling, so I said to Doc Savette here, there's somebody that needs your help, Doc. She's much obliged, I'm sure, said another friend, without gratitude. But you got her dress all wet when you stuck her head in the pool. Anything I hate is to get my head stuck in the pool, mumbled Miss Bedecker. They almost drowned me once over in New Jersey. Then you ought to leave it alone, countered Dr. Savette. Speak for yourself, cried Mrs. Bedecker violently. Your hand shakes. I wouldn't let you operate on me. It was like that. Almost the last thing I remember was standing with Daisy and watching the moving picture director and his star. So Daisy literally is witnessing an overly drunk person saying, we should play golf in the morning. She's seeing somebody who literally has been screaming her head off because of how she gets when she's drunk. And people it's just this hollow, empty, gross, hedonistic thing that Daisy's watching and that she's not used to. Because, again, people of her East Egger class don't do that. There is proper decorum. There are proper actions. You do not drink so much that you cannot control yourself. They were still under the white plum tree, and their faces were touching except for a pale, thin ray of moonlight between them. And it occurred to me that he had been very slowly bending toward her all evening to attain this proximity, and even while I watched, I saw him stoop one ultimate degree and kiss her cheek. I like her, said Daisy. I think she's lovely. But the rest offended her. And, inarguably, because it wasn't a gesture but an emotion. She was appalled by West Egg, this unprecedented place that Broadway had begotten upon Long Island Fishing Village. Appalled, so disgusted and shocked, by its raw vigor that chafed under the old euphemisms, and by the too obtrusive fate that herded its inhabitants along a short cut from nothing to nothing. So again, she is shocked, she is disgusted, and she sees that it's from nothing to nothing. There is just this emptiness and this hollowness. She saw something awful in the very simplicity she failed to understand. I sat on the front steps with them while they waited for their car. It was dark here in front. Only the bright door sent 10 square feet of light volleying out into the soft black morning. Sometimes a shadow moved against the dressing-room blind above, gave way to another shadow, and an indefinite procession of shadows that rouged and powdered in invisible glass. "Who is this Gatsby, anyhow?" demanded Tom suddenly. "Some big bootlegger?" So Tom, before any of them have keyed in, has guessed at Gatsby's game. "Where'd you hear that?" I inquired. "I didn't hear it. I imagined it. A lot of these newly rich people are just big bootleggers, you know." "Not Gatsby," I said shortly. He was silent for a moment. The pebbles of the drive crunched under his feet. Well, he certainly must have strained himself to get this menagerie together. A breeze stirred the gray haze of Daisy's fur collar. At least they are more interesting than the people we know, she said with an effort. So again, it's not that she necessarily really means that. And she's also kind of standing up to her husband, so that's why it's with an effort. You didn't look so interested. Well, I was. Tom laughed and turned to me. Did you notice Daisy's face when that girl asked her to put her under cold water? Daisy began to sing with the music in a husky, rhythmic whisper, bringing out a meaning in each word that it had never had before and would never have again. When the melody rose, her voice broke up sweetly, following it in a way contralto voices have, and each change tipped out a little of her warm human magic upon the air. Lots of people come who haven't been invited, she said suddenly, which again is something that East Acres never do. You do not just show up to somebody's house, show to dinner without being invited. That girl hadn't been invited. They simply forced their way in and he's too polite to object. I'd like to know who he is and what he does, insisted Tom, and I think I'll make a point of finding out. I can tell you right now, she answered. He owns some drugstores, a lot of drugstores. He built them up himself. So again, Daisy and Nick are constantly believing the best of Gatsby, and they don't know any better, right? The dilatory limousine came rolling up the drive. Good night, Nick, said Daisy. Her glance left me and sought the lighted top of the steps, where, 3 o'clock in the morning, a neat, sad little waltz of that year was drifting out to the open door. After all, in the very casualness of Gatsby's party, there were romantic possibilities totally absent from her world. What was it up there in the song that seemed to be calling her back inside? What would happen now in the dim, incalculable hours? Perhaps some unbelievable guest would arrive, a person infinitely rare and to be marveled at, some authentically radiant young girl who, with one fresh glance at Gatsby, one moment of magical encounter, would blot out those 5 years of unwavering devotion. So here you see Daisy's anxiety in leaving the party with Tom because she's worried that some beautifully radiant person will come into Gatsby's life and essentially wipe away the 5 years of devotion that he's shown to her. So you can see that she has some anxiety about the relationship too, and desperately wants it to happen. I stayed late that night. Gatsby asked me to wait until he was free, and I lingered in the garden until the inevitable swimming party had run up, chilled and exalted from the black beach, until the lights were extinguished in the guest rooms overhead. When he came down the steps at last, the tan skin was drawn unusually tight on his face, and his eyes were bright and tired. She didn't like it, he said immediately. Of course she did. She didn't like it, he insisted. She didn't have a good time. He was silent, and I guessed at his unutterable depression. I feel far away from her, he said. It's hard to make her understand. You mean about the dance? The dance? He dismissed all the dances he had given with a snap of his fingers. Old sport, the dance is unimportant. So here's a very, very key line. He wanted nothing less of Daisy than that she should go to Tom and say, I never loved you. After she had obliterated 4 years with that sentence, they could decide upon the more practical measures to be taken. One of them was that, after she was free, they were to go back to Louisville and be married from her house, just as if it were 5 years ago. So, as you can see on the screen, this in the movie is when he says, we need to tell Tom. But this goes with the hopeless romantic thing. He's finally achieved his dream. He's finally, he has Daisy. Daisy has seen his party, his house, his life, and what he's made of himself. And now he wants more. And he thinks that that's going to be easy. It's going to simply just be to Tom, right? Daisy saying, I've never loved you. And yet Nick, as the narrator, recognizes how hard that's going to be. Gatsby doesn't understand, or if Gatsby does understand, Gatsby assumes that Daisy is just so overcome with love for him that she is going to just march in and tell Tom this. But I don't think he understands, one, how controlling Tom is, how weak Daisy actually can be and comes across, and also the fact that Daisy and Tom have been married for 4 years. They have a little girl together. At the very beginning of their relationship, especially before Tom cheated on her, that I think that she genuinely could say that she loved him. And so there's this unbelievable pressure that Gatsby has now put on Daisy, in order for them to rewind this clock and go back 5 years ago and be married from her house. Something that he believes is possible, but that any normal human being would probably say, like, that's a lot harder than you're actually making it out to be. And she doesn't understand, he said. She used to be able to understand. We'd sit for hours. So again, there's this acknowledgement that she's changed, that he's changed, that their relationship has changed. And of course it has. It's been 5 years since they were there, and both of them have had lots of life experiences since then. He broke off and began to walk up and down a desolate path of fruit rinds and discarded favors and crushed flowers. I wouldn't ask too much of her, I ventured. You can't repeat the past. So Nick gets it. He's like, don't ask too much. You cannot repeat the past. And then this is what Daisy says. Or not Daisy. This is what he says. Can't repeat the past, he cried incredulously. Why, of course you can. Heart of the matter, he believes that he can repeat the past, and why not, right? He looked around him wildly, as if the past were lurking here in the shadow of his house, just out of his reach of his hand. I'm going to fix everything just the way it was before, he said, nodding determinedly. She'll see. He talked a lot about the past, and I gathered he wanted to recover something, some idea of himself, perhaps, that had gone into loving Daisy. His life had been confused and disordered since then, but if he could once return to a certain starting place and go over it all slowly, he could find out what that thing was. One autumn night, 5 years before, they had been walking down the street when the leaves were falling. So this is a flashback. And they came to a place where there were no trees, and the sidewalk was white with moonlight. They stopped here and turned toward each other. Now it was a cool night with that mysterious excitement in which comes at the two changes of the year. The quiet lights in the houses were humming out into the darkness, and there was a stir and bustle among the stars. Out of the corner of his eye, Gatsby saw that the blocks of the sidewalk really formed a ladder and mounted to a secret place above the trees. He could climb to it if he climbed alone. And once there, he could suck on the pap of life, gulp down the incomparable milk of wonder. So he's 5 years ago, they're walking the street. He's realizing, just like when, summer turns to fall and winter turns to spring, these like hope-filled times of the year, he's realizing, wow, I could have anything, right? And it's his potential. But if he wanted to have anything, it says he would have to climb the ladder alone, right? And Daisy, him being with Daisy doesn't mean that he would be alone, that he could be anything. His heart beat faster and faster as Daisy's white face came up to his own. He knew that when he kissed this girl and forever wed his unutterable visions to her perishable breath, his mind would never romp again like the mind of God. So that by kissing her, he is sealing his fate, his dreams, everything that he could be to her, rather than to beyond her, to that ladder up to the sky. So he had waited, listening for a moment longer to the tuning fork that had been struck upon the star. So again, it's like, what do I want to choose? Does my life want to be wedded to her and this dream of her, or does it want to be away from her and of my own choosing, of that 17-year-old dreaming of James Gatsby? And then he kissed her. So he made this decision. It's going to be her, all for her. At his lips' touch, she blossomed for him like a flower, and the incarnation was complete. Through all he said, even though his appalling sentimentality, I was reminded of something, an elusive rhythm, a fragment of lost words that I had heard somewhere a long time ago. For a moment, a phrase tried to take shape in my mouth, and my lips parted like a dumb man's, as though there was more struggling upon them than a wisp of startled air. But they made no sound, and what I had almost remembered was uncommunicable forever. So Nick's mind is essentially mirroring Gatsby's. He's at the cusp of this great thought, this great memory, right? And that's, Gatsby is at the cusp of his future and pursuing what he had dreamed as a poor farm boy in North Dakota. And then he's lost it because he chose a different path by kissing Daisy, just as Nick has lost that phrase that was just about to come to him. And therefore that phrase was uncommunicable forever, just like Gatsby's goals as a little child were forever uncommunicable because of his choice to pursue Daisy.